Keep in mind that this is a two-part series. I'll link part 1 in the card so you can watch that first. Enjoy! We'll start with some sloppy guidelines just to make sure we don't go too far off the rails. If you're drawing a character that already exists, keep in mind their general eye shape. For the character I'm drawing now, his eyes are shaped kind of like rounded scalene triangles. For capturing likeness, I recommend grabbing some references of some official art of the character you're drawing. I made 2 collages for this demo, one for eye shape references and one for real-life irises of a similar color, plus a few paintings with the shading effect I'm going for. This character is canonically Japanese, so I also pulled up some references of East Asian eyes. Here I'm drawing the upper and lower lash line along a simplified version of the character's eye shape. I'd like to mention that I default to a soft brush for most things. I do sharpen things later on, but just know that I'm only using 2 brushes, the airbrush and the G-pen. Draw in the eyebrows at the same time you draw in your eyes so you can allow them to influence each other. This bothered, angry expression means the eyebrows will furrow downwards and the upper lids will be pushed in that direction as a result. The brows affect the eyes a lot, so make sure to incorporate them together, especially if you find your expressions are stiff. The upper lash line is typically thicker than its counterpart. Some artists will even omit the lower lashes entirely. Do whatever you think looks good. I like to sharpen the ends of these lines just so they look less gloopy. For the irises, I'm gonna need you to try your best not to make this cross-eyed. Your eyes move different amounts because they are in 2 different places looking at the same thing. If you place the irises in the exact same spot on both eyes, you're gonna have a problem. References should help with this if you struggle. Draw a few lines for the eyelids, making sure they curve around the eyeball underneath. Now you can select the eyes and make any adjustments necessary, such as with the liquify or transformation tools. Here I just resized them to fit his face a bit better. Make sure one eye isn't shorter than the other and that they're level with each other. If you used a soft brush for your sketch, duplicate the layer once you're done and merge so it's easier to see. On a separate layer underneath the sketch, fill in the skin with a base tone. If you struggle with coloring and shading skin, I'll link my skin tutorial in the card, but keep in mind it's more casual than this one. I went ahead and rendered the hair a bit, but here we'll begin painting the eyes. I'm pretty sure I've merged the sketch and the base tone together already. Sorry, digital painter things. Before we start though, you'll want to administer a cleanup mission. Airbrush on top of any unnecessary sketch lines with the base skin tone. As someone whose paintings used to take months, keeping things tidy from the get-go will do wonders. I'll add some soft shading on the edges of the cheek, finally bringing some color into his face. I like to focus the blush under the eyes. After an initial pass of soft shading, I choose the local value of the hair and use a small airbrush to outline the upper and lower lash line according to the character's eye shape and the curve of the form underneath. I like to sharpen the inner and outer corners of the lashes to add some manual line weight. If your character's expression is symmetrical, make sure these lines match up on both sides. Both eyes should be equally tall at most angles. I like to call this thing a tail. It's a little extension of the upper lash line that continues around a sharp corner. Said corner is not the outer corner of the eye. This is. I consider this a weird side effect of unnatural stylization. Once again, I'll sharpen the outer edges of the lash line and I'll break up this edge here to show the viewer that this isn't just a thick line drawn in Sharpie. Just like earlier, I'll use an airbrush to remove any unnecessary sketch lines. On a separate layer, I'll add the shadows for the aegyo sol. They should take up the bottom half of the form. Then I'll alpha lock, slightly darken, and softly erase any messy edges. I'll add the epicanthal fold, making sure to curve the eyelid around the form. This crease on the outer corners creates a shadow underneath it, so I'm adding that as well. You'll notice throughout this video, I like to add highlights right up against my shadows. I do this simply to increase the contrast between the transition and in turn make the highlights look sharper. I make the aegyo sol curve more at the bottom, making it look a bit heavier, and on a separate layer, I'll add sharp highlights to the center of both. Then I'll go ahead and alpha lock said highlight layer and change it from white to a pale orange. With the G pen, I'll add the base color for the iris on another layer under the lashes, then proceed to soften the edges of the iris with a transparent airbrush. Remember to clean up sketch lines as soon as they lose their utility. On a new layer, I grab a deep blue from the hair and use the circular shape of the G pen to click and make a perfect circle for the pupils. I set them deeper into the iris to emphasize the space between it and the surface of the cornea. With a clipping layer, I'll use the gradient tool tool on the irises to add in some hue and value variation. On a new layer, I'll outline the outside edges of the iris with a deep blue, and then I'll change my mind and hue shift it to purple instead. After blending the edges farther into the iris, I'll add a circular shadow under the pupil with the airbrush to emphasize the highlighting south of it. As per usual, on a separate layer, I'll add a highlight to the side of the shadow and blend it outwards. I like to use a lot of hue variation, so you'll notice me alpha locking layers to change them very often. Here I'm just adding more saturation on the inside. After that, I'll add a darker shadow at the top of the iris and make a soft ring for the lower highlight. I'll erase the top of the ring and duplicate it to the other side. Then I'll shape it into the form, following some hue adjustments. Now it's time for streaks. On a new layer, I'll add some lines stemming from the pupil and curving outwards. Make sure to break up any big shapes and keep in mind your big, medium, and smalls. I'll add thinner lines beside the longer ones, blend some things out, etc. Try not to add too many details as it's easy for things to get cluttered fast. Once you're satisfied with that, it's time to clean up any messy edges and start the highlighting. I'll create a new layer, color pick a mid-tone from the iris, set the layer mode to screen, and add a sharp highlight in the shape of a crescent. Then I'll shape it out and cut it into sections. After that, I'll realize that I've used far too much pink in Wonder's blue eyes, so I'll hue shift both the highlight and the iris closer to correctness. Then I'll alpha lock and add some highlights to the inner edges of the screen layer and blend out the opposite ends. Right about now, I said f the screen layer and changed its mode to lighten instead. For the ring lights, I just used the shape of the G pen to place a circle, then minimize the size and erase a smaller circle. That way, it's pretty easy to decide the size and thickness. Pause. I'll outline the edges of the iris once more with a darker color underneath. Later, I'll add a soft purple as well. Then I'll use the G pen to color in the lower half of the eye on a screen layer and erase the top with a big airbrush. After that, I'll change the color to blue and lower the opacity. I'll make the squared highlights a nice orangey color later, but for now they've been switched to a pale yellow. Now I'm gonna add an overall shadow with the multiply layer. Remember to round out the edges to follow the shape of the sphere underneath the eye. Here I'm adding some wrinkles from the eyebrows and some deeper shadows at the start of the epicanthal fold, extending it towards the lower lash line. I'll add a highlight against the shadow of the tear duct to emphasize it and start refining the upper lids. If your character wears any eye makeup, now's a good time to add that. Now for the lashes, you're going to want to shade the outer corners and highlight the inner corners with the skin tone. I'll create a new layer and add the lashes on top with a hard brush. These thicker pieces are chunks of hair, and these thinner lines are singular. You want to maintain a mix of both. I'll alpha lock the lashes and brush the tips with a highlight. I'd recommend picking a color from somewhere in the area since hair is reflective. I just chose the red from his eyeliner. Make sure to blend the upper parts so they don't look separate from the layer beneath it. Chunks of hair have mass, so of course they will have shadows as well. Although I like to add these sparingly since I prefer a more wispy look. With all of that done, I'm gonna adjust the hue and luminosity of the multiply layer and finally add some highlights. I like to use fully saturated colors for this step. The reds are bounce light from the eyeliner, and I got that greenish hue from color picking the indigo in the iris and choosing the color on the opposite side of the color wheel. Now I'll erase some of the screen highlight around the rim of the iris and set it to lighten. Afterwards, I'll make the highlight more circular and erase some streaks back in. I'll take away some of the detail in the lower sect of the iris and add some highlights to the bottom of the sclera. On a new layer, I'll add the lower waterline under the lower lash line, then shape and shade the outer corners. Then I'll sharpen the wing and use the curved line tool to erase clean edges around the curves of the lash lines. I'll add highlights under the aegiosol and against the upper lid shadows. I'll deepen the creases created by the brows furrowing, add triangular blue highlights on the lashes, redo the eyebrows, and voila! It is time for me to take a nap. Goodbye!